For those of you who are watching at home, I hope that you will look at your bulletin that was sent by email and have bread and juice with you so that when it comes time that we take communion, that you'll take it with us at home. The Presbyterian has approved us taking communion that way, and I hope you'll participate with us. Please join me in the call to worship. Tonight is about a table.
A table where Jesus invited his disciples to share in a Passover meal. A table where Christ still invites us, his present-day disciples, to take, eat, and remember.
Tonight is about a garden.
A garden where Jesus prayed with such intensity that blood was spilled. A garden where one of his beloved disciples betrayed him, and all of them ran away.
Tonight, at this table and in this garden, we remember. Here we are on Maundy, Thursday, the Thursday of our journey with Jesus through the last week of his ministry. On Sunday, we celebrated Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and everything that followed that week. Today, during Holy Week, we're actually worshiping and remembering on Maundy, Thursday. Tonight, we look at Thursday through broken bread and broken trust. It began with a meal, which led to the garden and the kiss, and then the sword and the healing. But it all began with a meal. They all came, every one of them, one by one. Jesus, the light of the world, Peter, James, and John, Jesus' closest friends, and leaders in ministry who would accompany Jesus later to the Garden of Gethsemane where he prayed. And they struggled unsuccessfully to stay awake. We light a candle for each of them. First, there was Andrew. Andrew was Peter's brother, the one who actually introduced Peter to Jesus. Andrew, it seems, was always being left in charge of leading the others when Jesus, Peter, James, and John went off somewhere together. Then there was Matthew, the former tax collector, whose changed life would lead to writing one of the Gospels. Thomas, the twin, who would unfairly be labeled a doubter because he wasn't with them when Jesus appeared to the disciples for the first time after his resurrection. And then Simon, the zealot, just like Judas, but with different loyalties. Philip, who introduced Nathanael to Jesus. Nathanael, also called Bartholomew, probably the youngest, the one who asked the 4 traditional questions at the Passover Seder meal on that last Thursday of Jesus' life. James, the son of Alphaeus. One tradition says that he was the brother of Matthew and was also a tax collector like his brother. Others claim that he was the son of Mary, wife of Cleopas, who witnessed the risen Christ on the road to Emmaus. And there was Thaddeus, or the other Judas, the son of James, often referred to as Jude Thaddeus or Thaddeus Judas, so as not to be confused with Judas Iscariot, the betrayer. And that only leaves one, Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, a thief who used to take money from the common purse. We light a candle for him. Their presence lit up the table as Christ did. The Passover meal was and is the most important meal of the Jewish faith. It was an Independence Day of sorts, an Independence Day combined with family tradition, laughter, and a depth of seriousness that rivals all other faiths. It was a night whose roots went all the way back to the time of Moses. The words were a sacred tradition. On that night, Jesus took bread and wine and changed everything. Bread, simple unleavened bread that symbolized freedom and the hurried escape of Israel from slavery. This bread became a symbol of freedom from sin through forgiveness brought about by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. None of it made any sense to any of those disciples that gathered at that meal that night. The changes started with a piece of bread a very special piece of bread that was hidden in the pocket of the matzah tosh. This piece of bread was broken in half. Half of it was used with the bitter herbs. The other half was wrapped in a linen cloth and hidden away, like the body in a tomb. A piece of bread which is so important to the Seder that it couldn't be finished without it. It was and is the best piece. This is the piece that Jesus took and said, "Take, eat." This is my body broken for you. And then the wine, a common drink that was sometimes more sanitary than water, symbolizing the blood of the Lamb, which marked the doors of the Israelites when Pharaoh named his own punishment and proclaimed the death of every firstborn child. And now this firstborn child of God, God's only Son, the Lamb of God, would take away the sins of the world. He stood before the disciples and proclaimed the wine as a symbol of his blood to be poured out, like the blood on the doorposts, as a sign of life and a sign of forgiveness for the sins of the world. For this, Jesus used the third cup in the Seder meal. This third cup was also known as the cup of redemption. It was at this juncture in the ritual that those gathered would stand and they would open a door for Elijah the prophet, the one who would announce the coming of the Messiah. On the table during the Seder, this was a special cup. It was called Elijah's cup. It sits next to the plate which hold the symbols in their flight for freedom: the parsley, the bitter herbs, the hariseth, the boiled egg, the lamb shank, and the unleavened bread. This cup is called Elijah's cup because it is reserved for one of two people. Only the prophet Elijah or the Messiah could drink out of this cup. This is the cup that Jesus drank from. This is the cup he used as the cup of redemption. The blood of Christ shed for us. With their eyes wide and uncertain understanding, they drank, afraid to ask, but they drank. After the meal, Jesus did the unthinkable. The confession came after the partaking. He washed their feet. Peter claimed he was unworthy. Jesus said it must be done, or Peter would have no part in him. Peter surrendered to Jesus' touch. Please join me in the act of confession. We confess that we don't like it when Jesus offers to serve us,
to wash our feet.
But we
We also know that we need it. We need it more than we will ever know.
Jesus makes us clean on the inside and on the outside. We have been forgiven. Thanks be to God. Jesus had shown them what their upcoming ministry would be like For the very Son of God had come not to be served, but to serve. With questions running rampant through their minds, Jesus led them out of the upper room and into the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives, just outside the Golden Gate of the city, the gate which led to the temple. Standing in that place was an amazing thing. Did you know that there are olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane that are over 2,500 years old? That means that they were there at the time of the prophets. Ezekiel, Daniel, Obadiah, Zechariah, Joel, and Malachi all could have stood in the same spot overlooking Jerusalem. There's one tree that could have been there as long as the prophet of Jeremiah. Jesus could have prayed under that tree and that still stands today. The disciples could have marveled at how old it was when they stood around it and remarked that they were standing where the prophets had stood. This olive garden was filled not only with olive trees, but with the herb rosemary. It lined the walks and was tended like hedges. Its pungent odor permeates the place. It's there for a reason. Rosemary is the herb of remembrance.
With grief and shame.
There's nothing to suggest it in Scripture, but I like to think that rosemary was growing in the garden even back in Jesus' day. I think Jesus went to the garden to breathe deep the smell of rosemary, to kneel in the presence of the living history of those trees that were witnesses to the prophets. I think Jesus went there to remember. Bowed down with the weight and burden of the sin of the world he was about to bear, Jesus prayed and remembered. In his prayer, he cried out for mercy and courage and strength for the friends who couldn't stay awake. And he cried out to God, "Take this cup from me." And he remembered. Tempted to turn away, he remembered. He remembered his purpose. He remembered his calling. He remembered the love God has for him. And he remembered his love for us. The smell of rosemary filled him, and he remembered. He remembered. And as he remembered, that's when they came, feet marching, the sound of swords and leather scabbards clattering against the leather greaves of the armor of the temple guard, the sounds of spears that would have been used for walking sticks, murmurs and whispers, the shuffle of feet, the smell of torches and fear, the jingle of coins in a pouch, 30 coins to be exact, 30 pieces of silver. That was the price of betrayal. And the instrument of betrayal, the means by which the message "you're done for" was conveyed, was a kiss on the cheek. The guards stopped. The torches didn't really make it that much easier to see, and Jesus was still busy praying. Judas knelt down and kissed him on the cheek. I wonder if Jesus felt the burning of that kiss for the remainder of his days. I wonder if he still feels it now. Surely a kiss like that would have left some physical evidence behind, something to make it linger. Jesus, still filled with remembrance, knowing he would suffer, knowing his fate, his heart breaking, Jesus accepted the kiss from the one he called friend, and they grabbed him. The sudden movement, the noise, the sound of the kiss, I don't know what thing startled those sleeping disciples, but that's when Peter jumped up, his sword swinging. In startled anger, he wanted to defend Jesus. But even more, Peter wanted the events of that evening to cease unfolding. He didn't want to be put to the test. He didn't want to be put to the test and fail in denial. The sword swung. The blood flew. The ear of Malchus fell. I think it's curious that we know the name of this servant of the high priest, the servant of the sworn enemy of Jesus. I think it's curious because this is the last miracle that Jesus performs. In one flick of the finger or blink of an eye, Jesus could have destroyed this whole group, but he didn't. In compassion, Jesus tells the disciples to put away their swords, and then, without even thinking, his death imminent, yet his love and compassion for humanity still oozing from his very pores, Jesus reaches out and heals the man. In stunned silence, the guards and conspirators drag Jesus off for his trumped up sham of trial. One by one, the disciples, they scattered and deserted him, until all there was left was three. Peter, who had run into the terror of the night as the cock crowed, and he realized that he had denied Jesus not once, but for a third time. And Judas, who would follow behind for a little while, and then I think finally came to himself and couldn't stand what he saw, what he had become. And he couldn't stand to see another way out. He didn't think he could be forgiven because he couldn't forgive himself. So he did what no one has the right to do, and he snuffed out his own life in anger, regret, grief, and remorse. He betrayed the Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah, for 30 lousy pieces of silver. And then he threw God's greatest gift, life itself, back into God's face. Only one candle remained. Only one would follow Jesus to Calvary and stand at the foot of the cross with Jesus' mother, and that was John. And he was dying. As he was dying, Jesus turned the care of his mother over to John. And when the light of the world was hung on the cross to die, when the bread of life broken for our sake, when the light of the world was extinguished that day, John was the only disciple that remained. That first Holy Thursday started as bright and filled with promise as any other day. What began with a meal led to the garden and to the kiss, and then the sword into the last healing. And it ended with Jesus being arrested, tried on false charges, and the next day put to death. Indeed, what wondrous love is this? Christ fed us, served us, and was arrested for us. Tomorrow, we will remember his death for us. I will not tell you to go in peace this night, because this night, our peace has been shattered by arrest and betrayal. Our peace will have to wait in a tomb. But know this, in this waiting, we are not alone. The God of love, who sent his Son to save us, is still with us. Amen.